At 5:40 on the evening of Hawthorne Shore's 20th anniversary gala, the string quartet stopped playing, not because the speeches had started, but because the wind shifted. A sour, swampy smell rolled across the event lawn from the lake. Guests turned toward the water, where the surface that had been clear just 2 weeks earlier was now streaked with green scum. A thick band of algae had collected along the clubhouse shoreline, and every small wave pushed the stench farther into the tables set for dinner. By 6 o'clock, staff were moving food indoors, and by 6:15, the lakeside ceremony was officially canceled. By 7, the Homeowners Association had shut the outdoor terrace completely. My name is David Mercer. I was 54 years old, and I own 12 acres on the western shore of Lake Bellamy, a private 8-acre lake in western North Carolina. The lake itself belonged entirely to me, while Hawthorne Shores bordered the eastern side, where its clubhouse, pool deck, and event lawn overlooked the water. For years, the relationship worked beautifully because everybody benefited from the exact same thing, a healthy lake. That all changed when HOA President Elaine Porter decided the low hum from my aeration compressor was ruining the community's evening atmosphere. The system sat inside a ventilated enclosure behind my workshop, powering diffusers on the lake bottom to keep the ecosystem alive. The compressor was not loud, but on incredibly still nights, residents out on the HOA terrace could hear a soft mechanical hum. Elaine called it a nuisance, which quickly escalated into a formal violation, and finally, an unacceptable interference with premium lakefront amenities. In response, I sent the board our water quality records, maintenance logs, and a detailed report from an aquatic consultant. The documentation clearly explained that the aeration helped keep the water column mixed, supporting vital dissolved oxygen during the brutal hot summer weather. I strictly warned them that shutting it down for an extended period during a hot, calm stretch could drastically increase the risk of stagnant conditions, algae growth, and severe odor. Elaine completely dismissed the warning, and the board demanded absolute silence leading up to their anniversary event. After a tense mediation, I agreed to shut the system off temporarily while the noise dispute was formally reviewed. But I didn't just turn it off. I meticulously documented the date, the hour, the water temperature, the weather, and every single dissolved oxygen reading from that moment onward. By day 4, the oxygen dropped, and by day 7, the water started losing its clarity. On day 10, thick green streaks appeared along the eastern shore, and by day 13, the unmistakable smell of decay started to rise. Day 14 was the gala. By the time Hawthorne Shore's insurer and an independent lake consultant reviewed the entire file, they found a sentence in the original lake management plan that no one on the current board seemed to know existed. It read, "Continuous summer aeration recommended to reduce stagnation and algal bloom risk." Elaine had spent months aggressively trying to silence a machine, and 2 weeks later, 200 affluent guests learned exactly what that silence smelled like. Lake Bellamy was never meant to be a resort lake. It actually started as a simple farm pond. My father and I expanded it back in the 1990s when we bought the adjoining acreage, utilizing an old earthen dam on the southern end and a spring-fed inlet from the west. We dug out enough depth in the center to comfortably support a healthy population of bass and bluegill. For years, we managed the property simply by mowing the banks, keeping the runoff controlled, and clearing out any debris from the inlet. Then came the brutal summer of 2013, a season that was relentlessly hot, bone dry, and completely devoid of wind for days on end. The lake stratified badly as the upper water warmed, and the lower water lost its crucial oxygen supply. A late summer turnover eventually left dead fish floating near the dam, and to this day, I still remember the putrid smell and the eerie silence. There were no frogs near the shoreline, and absolutely no fish feeding at dusk. There was just stagnant gray water and dead bass washing up along the reeds. After that environmental disaster, I hired a professional aquatic consultant named Aaron Pike, who designed a highly effective bottom-diffused aeration system with 2 separate diffuser stations. The main compressor sat securely on land, pushing air through weighted lines directly to the lake bottom. The bubbles would rise slowly, helping to continuously circulate the water and prevent stratification. It was certainly not magic. It did not instantly eliminate nutrients, nor did it guarantee we would never see algae again. But it became the cornerstone of a much larger management plan where we planted specific shoreline vegetation, reduced fertilizer runoff, strictly monitored dissolved oxygen, and meticulously maintained the inlet. Through all that hard work, the lake drastically improved. When Hawthorne Shores was built several years later, the developer heavily marketed the pristine water view, which I did not object to at all. The Homeowners Association did not own a single drop of that lake, but their residents thoroughly enjoyed looking at it, holding weddings, summer dinners, yoga classes, and lavish anniversary parties right on the shoreline. That arrangement was perfectly fine with me, especially since the original developer completely understood the legal boundaries. Their approved landscape plan even included a specific note about maintaining buffer vegetation and respecting all private lake management equipment. For several peaceful years, absolutely nobody complained about the compressor running in the background. Then Elaine became president of the board, bringing with her a unique talent for taking incredibly small annoyances and weaponizing them into major board priorities. First it was the leaf blowers, then the dock lights, and then the pool music. Eventually, and inevitably, my lake aerator became her ultimate target. Her first email dramatically called it persistent evening machinery noise, prompting me to walk the exact property line with a professional sound meter. The decibel readings were entirely modest. Yes, you could hear it if you stood right next to the compressor enclosure. But directly across the lake, the sound faded and perfectly blended into the normal, ambient background noise. Still, wanting to be a reasonable neighbor, I offered several mechanical improvements: rubber isolation mounts, a denser acoustic lining, and a timer that reduced the compressor load during certain low-risk periods. Aaron reviewed the proposed idea and told me that limited nighttime adjustments could be perfectly reasonable, provided the water conditions allowed for it. But Elaine aggressively wanted more. She demanded the machine be turned off during all evening events, then off every single night, and finally, completely off for the entire 2-week lead-up to their massive anniversary gala. That was the precise moment I put my foot down and officially objected. If you ever own a pond, drainage system, retaining structure, pump, or any piece of critical infrastructure that looks completely unnecessary to somebody who didn't install it, keep the records explaining exactly why it exists. People will always notice the hum, the exposed pipe, or the ugly metal box long before they ever understand the vital job it is quietly doing in the background. If you have ever watched an HOA treat a highly technical system like a simple decoration problem, let me know, and share this story with anyone who owns water or land right beside a subdivision. I was more than willing to make the compressor quieter and less intrusive, but Elaine wanted it completely silent, and as she was about to learn, those two things are definitely not the same. The conflict rapidly escalated in May when Hawthorne Shores sent me a formal nuisance notice, blatantly ignoring the fact that my property existed entirely outside of their HOA declaration. Their attorney was smart enough not to claim they could fine me as a member, so instead, the board threatened a costly private nuisance action, basing their entire case on repeated noise complaints originating from the clubhouse terrace. My attorney, Rachel Sloan, sharply responded that the compressor was part of a long-standing, critical lake management system, pointing out that the HOA's own luxury events had been held right beside it for years. Still, dragging this through litigation would have been incredibly expensive for both sides, so we agreed to a formal mediation where Elaine confidently arrived with a thick, heavily tabbed folder full of resident complaints. Aaron arrived armed with years of irrefutable water quality records, taking a very measured and scientific position. He explained that while the system could potentially be made quieter, a full, unmitigated shutdown during hot summer conditions absolutely should not happen without strict monitoring and a rock-solid contingency plan. Listening to both sides, the mediator proposed a temporary, legally binding compromise. I would shut the compressor off while we thoroughly evaluated sound mitigation, and in return, the HOA would immediately stop threatening frivolous legal action against my property. Crucially, we agreed that if the lake conditions deteriorated in any way, both parties would immediately revisit the shutdown order. I agreed to the terms, but before I ever flipped that switch, I recorded every single baseline metric. I logged the surface temperature, the bottom temperature, the dissolved oxygen levels, the water clarity, and the extended weather forecast. The compressor officially stopped at 8:03 on a quiet Monday morning, and for the first 2 days, absolutely nothing happened. Feeling victorious, Elaine sent a smug message out to the residents, happily announcing that the lakefront had finally returned to peaceful, silent conditions. By day 4, the lower water oxygen reading dropped sharply, prompting me to instantly send Aaron the alarming numbers, and he instructed me to continue monitoring the decline. Day 5 was blisteringly hot, with absolutely no wind to disturb the surface. By day 6, the eastern shoreline developed a faint, undeniable green tint, which I immediately photographed and logged into the record. On day 7, the Secchi depth had declined so severely that Aaron wrote an official warning, stating that the prolonged aeration shutdown during the current temperature was rapidly increasing the risk of aggressive algal growth and severe odor. Rachel promptly forwarded the email directly to Hawthorne Shores, but Elaine stubbornly replied that a temporary color change did not justify restoring the dreadful noise right before their prestigious anniversary event. By day 9, I noticed ugly surface streaks forming around noon, and by day 10, the stagnant water near the clubhouse side looked like a dull, toxic green. On day 11, the maintenance staff at Hawthorne Shores formally complained about a rotting odor lingering around the event lawn early in the morning. Their frantic manager called me directly, but I simply told him the exact same thing I had warned the board about, that the aeration system needed to come back on immediately. He sounded genuinely worried, but Elaine did not care in the slightest. The HOA had already spent thousands of dollars on luxury tents, imported flowers, premium catering, lighting, and live entertainment for the anniversary. She genuinely believed that restarting the compressor would create far more complaints from the high society guests than a slightly green lake ever would. That was her absolute final decision, not mine, and certainly not Aaron's. Shortly after, I received a leaked internal email from Thomas Green, who was one of the quieter, more reasonable board members. Elaine had aggressively written to the board, demanding they keep it shut down until after the anniversary, because they absolutely could not have that hum during the event. Thomas had nervously replied, pointing out that they had a written water quality warning and asking if they were truly sure this was worth the risk. There was no meaningful response from Elaine or the board, so the compressor stayed dead silent, and only 3 days remained until the gala. By then, I fully understood that this dispute was no longer just about machinery noise, so I began meticulously building an ironclad legal record. Every single morning at 7 a.m., I measured the dissolved oxygen at fixed points, using the exact same locations, the exact same depths, and the exact same meter. Aaron professionally calibrated the equipment and thoroughly documented the testing procedure to ensure our data was flawless. I saved precise weather data from a small station near my workshop, tracking the air temperature, wind speed, and rainfall. I took high-resolution photographs from the exact same spot on my dock every single day, and I also downloaded the continuous security camera footage covering the entire eastern half of the lake. The ecological change was slow enough that you could easily miss it if you were just casually standing there, but on a time-lapse video, the devastation was glaringly obvious. Day 1 showed clear, dark water. Day 6 revealed a sickly green cast. Day 9 showed heavy surface streaking. And by day 12, there was a massive, visible accumulation of sludge packed tightly along the eastern shoreline. Knowing we needed absolute leverage, Rachel formally requested Hawthorne Shore's historical lake files, since the original developer had once participated in a joint shoreline management agreement. That deep search uncovered the exact document the current board had arrogantly ignored and apparently never reviewed: a highly detailed 2016 aquatic management memorandum. The original developer had actually commissioned it, after expressing serious concern about nutrient-loading runoff from their newly landscaped common areas. The professional report discussed shoreline plants, fertilizer management, stormwater drainage, and most importantly, aeration. One specific, glowing line stood out above the rest: continuous summer aeration, recommended to reduce stagnation and algal bloom risk during hot, low-wind periods. Even worse for the HOA. Another section strictly warned that the clubhouse shoreline was especially vulnerable to wind-driven surface accumulation purely because of its geographical orientation. That meant if a toxic bloom ever developed, the eastern side was exactly where all the disgusting, visible material was naturally going to collect. And the grand anniversary lawn sat right in the middle of that exact impact zone. Rachel immediately sent the damning memorandum straight to the HOA attorney, and this time, the attorney did not dare dismiss it. He frantically recommended restarting the aeration system and relocating the compressor temporarily if it was absolutely necessary, the exact same logical compromise that Aaron had already proposed months ago. We could easily move the compressor farther uphill, run significantly longer air lines, and add temporary acoustic barriers to block the noise. It was certainly not ideal, but it would absolutely reduce the sound substantially for their precious event. The only catch was that the HOA would have to approve quick access near one narrow service strip, but out of sheer spite, Elaine delayed the approval. She demanded exhaustive cost estimates, then a full committee review, and then a written, legally binding assurance that absolutely no event equipment would be disturbed during the move. Critical hours just disappeared into bureaucratic nonsense, and by the day before the gala, the rotting water smelled highly noticeable, even from my side of the dock. Aaron came out to the property in person, and his first reaction was completely professional and utterly devoid of drama. He quietly looked at the sickly water, checked the depleted oxygen levels, and closely examined the sludgy shoreline before calmly stating that we desperately needed to restore the circulation. Rachel sent an urgent final legal notice, forcing the HOA to finally agree in principle late that evening. But by then, the horrific bloom conditions were already permanently established. I forcefully restarted the compressor, the bubbles finally returned, and the heavy water began moving again. But the putrid smell absolutely did not vanish. Aeration could not magically reverse 2 full weeks of severe, deteriorating conditions overnight, and the wind forecast for the very next afternoon was blowing in from the west, straight toward the luxury clubhouse. The grand anniversary event began precisely at 4 o'clock, and at first, everything looked perfectly normal, featuring crisp white tables, elegant gold ribbons, ambient string lights, and a massive stage set up near the clubhouse terrace. The lake still looked sickeningly green, but for the moment, the thickest surface accumulation remained floating farther offshore. Then, as if on cue, the afternoon breeze increased, and by 5:30, massive, thick streaks of rotting algae began moving steadily east. The first wave of toxic material hit the shoreline just 20 minutes later. The well-dressed guests noticed the repulsive color right before they noticed the overwhelming smell, and then the suffocating odor of raw decomposition violently hit the event lawn. The panicked staff desperately tried lighting scented candles, then bringing out industrial fans, and finally slamming the terrace doors completely shut. But none of it mattered in the slightest. The extravagant outdoor dinner was rapidly shoved inside. The planned lakeside awards ceremony was entirely cancelled, and several disgusted elderly residents just left the party early. The premium catering company aggressively demanded their service area be moved as far away from the rotting shore as possible, forcing the defeated HOA to close down the entire waterfront walkway to reduce any physical contact with the floating scum. Fortunately, no one was poisoned, and no dramatic medical crisis occurred, which was legally the most important factor in the fallout. A lake can certainly suffer an ugly algal bloom without every single patch of green water automatically becoming a lethal, toxic emergency. However, the county environmental health office was immediately notified because the wealthy residents were in a state of absolute panic. The authorities strongly advised avoiding all contact with the visible scum, while professional sampling and a full evaluation occurred. The HOA was forced to hire a wildly expensive emergency lake contractor the very next morning, which inevitably dragged their insurance provider into the mess. The insurer immediately retained an independent aquatic consultant named Dr. Melissa Hart, who meticulously reviewed every single piece of evidence. She scrutinized the nutrient history, the temperature logs, the rainfall, the wind patterns, the aeration records, my daily monitoring data, the original developer files, and the exact event timeline. Her professional conclusion was incredibly careful, but legally devastating. She noted that the extreme heat and nutrient availability created highly favorable conditions for algal growth, and the abnormally low wind certainly contributed to the disaster. While the aeration shutdown was not the sole cause of the bloom, the prolonged loss of mechanical circulation and severely reduced dissolved oxygen had materially worsened the lake conditions during the most critical, vulnerable period. That was exactly why Aaron had explicitly warned them in writing. Dr. Hart then reviewed the damning email chain, reading through Aaron's first urgent warning, my flawless monitoring logs, the 2016 management memorandum, the HOA attorney's desperate recommendation, and Thomas Green's ignored concerns. Finally, she read Elaine's arrogant, fatal sentence. Shut it down until after the anniversary. The second she saw that email, the massive insurer immediately stopped treating the ruined event as a random, unpreventable weather problem. The HOA board had consciously made a terrible management decision immediately after receiving strict, technical warnings from multiple professionals, and in the eyes of the insurance company, that arrogant decision changed absolutely everything. The county's actual role in the fallout was far narrower than the outraged residents had expected. They did not violently seize the lake, nor did they issue some dramatic, bank-breaking environmental punishment. They simply reviewed the visible bloom, advised standard contact precautions while the toxic conditions were assessed, and quietly coordinated around the basic sampling and public health concerns. The lake remained entirely private, and the ultimate management responsibility remained solely mine. But the HOA's precious recreation shoreline had to be handled with extreme care until the foul conditions naturally improved. The heavily overpriced emergency contractor began a massive cleanup operation along the sludgy eastern edge, removing the rotting floating material wherever it was practically possible. Meanwhile, my aeration system ran continuously at full power. Aaron expertly adjusted the diffuser timing, and we strictly monitored the dissolved oxygen levels twice daily. The humiliated HOA was forced to permanently suspend all fertilizer application anywhere near the clubhouse shoreline, and a noisy temporary pump helped move the horribly stagnant water near one extremely shallow corner of the property. Within several grueling days, the suffocating odor finally decreased, though the water clarity improved much more slowly. And then, the brutal financial reality of their arrogance finally hit them. Hawthorne Shores had lost a massive part of its 20th anniversary event, eating the cost of the outdoor setup fees, the extra catering labor, and the chaotic emergency indoor reconfiguration. On top of that, they had to pay for the massive cleanup, the independent consultants, the water testing, the temporary shoreline controls, their mounting legal expenses, and a punishing insurance deductible. It was certainly not a $1 million disaster, but it didn't need to be. The final total was more than painful enough for the board to swallow. Striking while the iron was hot, Rachel officially reopened our noise dispute, aggressively arguing that the HOA could never again demand another prolonged shutdown without a full technical review, simply because the catastrophic consequences were now heavily documented. Cornered and defeated, Hawthorne Shore's attorney completely agreed. All the ridiculous fines and empty nuisance threats were immediately withdrawn, and instead, we finally created a practical, lasting solution. The compressor was moved much farther from the shoreline and placed into a heavily insulated, purpose-built acoustic enclosure with far better ventilation. High-quality rubber isolation mounts completely reduced the ground vibration, and the brand-new air lines were buried deep underground. The noise level at the clubhouse dropped so significantly that you had to strain to hear it, and the life-saving aeration continued uninterrupted through the brutal hot season. It was the exact same logical compromise that I had calmly proposed months earlier, completely ignored by a power-hungry board. Then, the disgraced board held its highly anticipated annual meeting. The residents were absolutely furious about their ruined celebration, but the strongest, most violent reaction came when Thomas stood up and displayed the undeniable timeline. He proved that the written water quality warning had arrived well before the event even started, that the developer memorandum had existed in their own files for years, and that their own highly paid attorney had desperately advised restarting the machine. A perfectly viable technical solution had been available the entire time, but Elaine had intentionally delayed every single fix just because she selfishly wanted absolute silence for her perfect gala. One furious homeowner stood up and demanded to know why the board had recklessly gambled with the lake conditions to protect an event that literally depended on the lake looking good. No answer Elaine gave helped her case. A swift, brutal motion completely removed Elaine from any authority over environmental and facilities decisions, and a formal recall petition immediately followed. Knowing she was beaten, she humiliatingly resigned before they could even hold the vote, and Thomas quickly became the interim president. His very first policy change legally required a full technical review before the Homeowners Association could ever demand the shutdown or alteration of any equipment affecting water, drainage, slope stability, fire access, or other shared environmental conditions. That rule was not petty revenge. It was exactly what should have existed from the very beginning. By late August, Lake Bellamy finally looked like its beautiful self again. The water was clear enough to easily see the shallows, with healthy bass actively feeding near the dock, and dragonflies buzzing over the reeds. There was no more disgusting green scum packed against the clubhouse bank, and absolutely no rotting odor hanging over the luxury terrace. The new compressor enclosure worked far better than I ever expected. From my private workshop, I could still hear it running, but from the HOA lawn, most people barely even noticed it existed. That was all this ridiculous dispute had ever actually needed. Basic engineering, not fragile human ego. The following year, Hawthorne Shores held another beautiful anniversary dinner right beside the lake. It was a smaller, much simpler affair, and there were absolutely no arguments about the aerator. The system ran perfectly throughout the entire evening, and nobody complained once. A few curious residents even asked Aaron to give a short, educational talk about proper lake management at their next community meeting. I did not attend the meeting because I was out peacefully fishing on my boat. People later called the anniversary disaster sweet karma, but I never really liked using that word for it. A toxic bloom cost me my pristine water quality too. The fish were mine, and the lake was mine. Every single day that the water looked worse, I was helplessly watching something I had spent years carefully managing rapidly deteriorate. I honestly would have preferred that their event go perfectly without a hitch. What truly satisfied me in the end was not the horrific smell, but rather what came after it. The Homeowners Association finally stopped treating a critical, technical system like a mere decorative nuisance. They fully accepted the harsh reality that a healthy lake sometimes requires heavy equipment. Noise can always be reduced, vibration can easily be isolated, and a compressor can definitely be relocated. But you absolutely do not solve a complex water management problem by arrogantly pretending that the equipment serves no purpose. If you own a pond, lake, pump, aerator, drainage system, retaining wall, or anything else that drastically affects how land or water behaves, always keep the maintenance history and the professional recommendations ready. If an entitled neighbor ever pressures you to shut it down, heavily document the specific warnings before you ever make the change. And if you think Hawthorne Shores crossed a massive legal line by blatantly ignoring technical advice just to make one single event a little bit quieter, tell me in the comments. Would you have agreed to the temporary shutdown, or would you have aggressively insisted on relocating the compressor first? Share this story with someone who lives beside a managed pond or lake. Save the video if you love HOA disputes, where hard evidence completely changes the balance of power. And subscribe for more stories where the absolute strongest response is not petty revenge, but rather understanding what a system is actually doing before somebody turns it off. Elaine genuinely thought the aerator was ruining the evening with a soft hum. 2 weeks later, Hawthorne Shores brutally learned exactly what silence smelled like.